The moment Frank Brooks walked into the Dusty Creek trading post on a Wednesday morning in the spring of 1882, he had absolutely no intention of getting married. And yet by the time the sun had set on that very same town 3 months later, he would be standing at an altar with his heart hammering so hard against his ribs he could barely draw breath. Not from reluctance, but from something else entirely. Something he had no language for until a woman named Matilda Ford taught him every single word. Dusty Creek, Texas sat in the belly of the Panhandle like a stone someone had swallowed and forgotten about. It was not the kind of town that appeared on many maps, and the maps that did include it often misspelled the name or placed it a few miles east of where it actually was. The population hovered somewhere around 200 souls depending on the season, swelling slightly when the cattle drives pushed through in spring, and thinning to almost nothing in the dead of winter when the wind came down from the north so cold and so sharp that it felt personal. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a church that had been rebuilt twice after fires, a small schoolhouse, and a doctor's office that doubled as the town's unofficial courthouse whenever Judge Harmon came through on his quarterly circuit. That was Dusty Creek. That was the whole of it. Frank Brooks had been the town's deputy sheriff for going on 4 years, and before that he had spent 2 years riding for a cattle operation out of Abilene that had gone bankrupt in the drought of 1878. He was 31 years old, wide in the shoulder and lean everywhere else, with dark hair that curled behind his ears when it got too long, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same red clay the creek banks were made from. People in Dusty Creek generally liked Frank. He was fair, he was steady, and he had a way of handling trouble without making more of it, which was a rarer quality in a lawman than most towns appreciated. He did not drink heavily. He did not gamble beyond a friendly card game on Friday evenings, and he had no enemies worth speaking of, or at least no living ones. What Frank Brooks did not have, and had not had for the better part of a decade, was any meaningful connection to another human being that ran deeper than professional courtesy, or the kind of easy friendship that lived at the surface of things and never asked anything difficult of you. He had learned to prefer it that way. He had learned, after the loss of his mother when he was 19 and the complicated grief that followed his father's departure from his life shortly after, that the fewer points of attachment a man had, the fewer ways the world could hurt him. He was not miserable. He was not even particularly lonely, or so he told himself on the nights when the wind came through the gaps in his cabin walls, and the sound of it was too much like breathing. He was simply a man who had organized his life around the absence of risk, and he had done such a thorough job of it that most of Dusty Creek had stopped trying to introduce him to their daughters, their sisters, or their widowed neighbors years ago. That changed on the Wednesday morning in May of 1882 when the southbound stage pulled into Dusty Creek carrying, among its dust-covered passengers, one Matilda Ford. Frank was standing outside the trading post talking to Amos Wheeler, the postmaster, about a string of small thefts that had been occurring along the southern road, when the stage rattled to a stop in the middle of Main Street and the door swung open. He noticed her the way you notice something that does not quite fit with the rest of the picture, not because she was doing anything particularly remarkable, but because there was something in the way she stepped down from that coach that was entirely unlike the way tired, road-beaten travelers usually descended from stages in Dusty Creek. Most people who arrived here looked like they were arriving at the end of something. Matilda Ford stepped out of that stage like she was arriving at the beginning. She was 26 years old, though Frank did not know that yet. She had brown hair that had mostly escaped whatever arrangement it had started the journey in, and it curled around her face in the heat in a way that looked accidental and completely natural all at once. Her dress was practical deep blue cotton, road-dusted but well-made, and she carried a single carpet bag and a wooden crate with air holes in the top that was emitting a soft, indignant sound. She looked around the street with dark eyes that took everything in with the calm, measuring quality of someone who has learned to assess a place quickly because her circumstances have required it. Then she picked up her crate, set her bag on her shoulder, and walked with great purpose toward the trading post, which happened to be exactly where Frank was standing. She nearly walked directly into him. She stopped 2 inches from his chest, looked up, and said without any preamble whatsoever, "I beg your pardon. Can you tell me where I might find the sheriff?" "Deputy Sheriff," Frank said. "Are you him?" "I am." She shifted the crate under her arm and stuck her free hand out. "Matilda Ford. I have a letter of introduction from the land office in Amarillo. I've purchased the old Hennessy homestead on the North Road." Frank shook her hand because it was the thing to do and was surprised by the firmness of her grip. "The Hennessy place has been empty for 2 years," he said. "I'm aware of that. The roof has gone soft in the back section. I'm also aware of that. There's a well that needs relining. She paused. "Brooks, Frank Brooks." "Mr. Brooks, I have purchased the property, I have reviewed the assessor's report, and I am familiar with its condition. I am not here to be talked out of it. I'm here because I was told I should introduce myself to the law when I arrived, and so here I am introducing myself." She tilted her chin up slightly. "Is there anything else you need from me, or am I free to go find a place to put my chicken?" From inside the crate, as if on cue, came a single sharp cluck. Amos Wheeler, who had been listening to all of this with barely concealed delight, made a sound that was half cough and half laugh. Frank ignored him. "No," Frank said. "You're free to go, Miss Ford. Thank you, Deputy." She walked past him and into the trading post, and Frank watched her go with the expression of a man who has just had a very ordinary morning interrupted by something he does not yet have the words for. "Well," said Amos Wheeler, "she's something." "She's a homesteader," Frank said flatly. "That's all." He believed it when he said it. He believed it for approximately 3 days. The Hennessy homestead was 6 miles north of Dusty Creek on the far side of a long, flat stretch of grazing land that gave way to a shallow creek and a stand of cottonwood trees. It was a reasonable piece of land, actually good soil, decent water access, and sheltered from the worst of the northern wind by a long natural rise in the ground. The house itself was a 2-room adobe structure with a covered porch and a small barn that had fared better than the living quarters over the years of vacancy. What it was not was easy. Restoring a homestead that had sat empty for 2 years in the Texas Panhandle was work that would have challenged a family of 4 with strong backs and established resources. Matilda Ford had arrived alone. Frank told himself the first time he rode out to check on her that it was part of his regular patrol route. This was not precisely true. The North Road was not part of his regular patrol route, but it was on the edge of his jurisdiction, and it was not unreasonable for him to extend his circuit in that direction. And so he did. And when he came around the bend in the cottonwoods and saw Matilda Ford on the roof of the Hennessy house with a hammer in one hand and a fistful of wooden shingles in the other, he pulled his horse up and stared for a moment before he called out to her. "You are going to fall through that roof," he said. She looked down at him without alarm. "The beam is solid. It's only the surface layer that's gone soft, and I've been replacing it section by section." "How long have you been up there?" "Since about 6 this morning. It was past noon. Have you eaten anything?" She paused, a small pause, but Frank caught it. "I'll eat when I come down." He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post that was still standing, and walked to the base of the ladder she had propped against the wall. "Come down and eat something now. I can hear your stomach from here." "You cannot hear my stomach from there, Miss Ford." There was a silence in which he could hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods and a meadowlark somewhere out in the grass. And then Matilda Ford came down the ladder with the hammer still in her hand, because she was apparently the kind of woman who did not set down tools unnecessarily. She looked at him with an expression that was partly irritated and partly something softer that she was working hard to keep under control. "I have cornbread," she said, as though offering this grudgingly. "I have hard cheese and jerky in my saddlebag," he said. Between the two of us, that's a meal." They sat on the porch and ate together, and Frank learned in the space of that single hour more about Matilda Ford than he had learned about most people in years of acquaintance. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, and had come west at 22 with a husband who had died of fever in Amarillo 3 years prior. His name had been Daniel Ford, and she said his name plainly, without the careful softness that indicated a wound still open, which told Frank that she had done her grieving and come through the other side of it. She had no children. She had no family left in Missouri. She had spent the 3 years since Daniel's death doing what women in her position often did, which was a combination of teaching, sewing, and boarding with families who needed help, and she had saved every spare dollar she could put her hands on until she had enough to purchase a piece of land and begin something that was genuinely her own. "Why this far out?" Frank asked. "Why not closer to town, somewhere with neighbors?" "Because the land closer to town costs more," she said simply. "And because I don't need neighbors as much as I need space." She looked out across the flat stretch of grass toward the distant line of the horizon. "I want to grow things. I want to raise chickens and have a kitchen garden, and in a few years' time, if things go well, maybe a small herd of cattle. I want to build something that belongs to me." She said it without apology and without sentimentality. It was simply the truth of her, stated plainly, and it landed on Frank with a weight he had not expected. He rode back to town that evening thinking about the way she had said, "I want to build something that belongs to me," and the particular quality of certainty in her voice when she said it, and the way the late afternoon light had caught in her dark eyes when she looked at the horizon, and he told himself with great firmness that this was not something he needed to think about. He was back out on the North Road 3 days later. He told himself again that it was patrol. The thing about Dusty Creek in the spring of 1882 was that it was not, by the standards of the Texas Panhandle, a particularly violent or lawless place. The real trouble in those years was further south and west. The Lincoln County wars had burned out 2 years prior. Billy the Kid had been shot by Pat Garrett back in July of '81. And the era of the open-range cattle wars was beginning to slow under the pressure of barbed wire and territorial law. Dusty Creek had its share of Saturday night trouble at the Broken Spur, the occasional dispute over water rights or fence lines, and a persistent problem with a loose group of small-time thieves who worked the road between Dusty Creek and the nearest larger town of Callaway Springs to the east, but nothing that kept Frank from the North Road on a regular basis. He learned, over those first weeks of May, that Matilda Ford was the most self-sufficient person he had ever encountered. She had repaired most of the roof herself before he could arrange for help from Tom Birch the carpenter, who came out and finished the last section and declared the job almost professionally done. She had renegotiated the price of her supplies at the trading post by pointing out that she was intending to be a long-term customer, and that Henry Pratt, who ran the store, was charging her a rate that was, by her careful calculation, 12% higher than what he charged the male homesteaders in the area. Henry Pratt had sputtered and gone red and then, after a long pause, adjusted her account, because Matilda Ford had presented her case with the precise, measured clarity of her schoolteacher father, and there had been nothing sensible to argue with. She had also, Frank discovered, been teaching herself to handle a rifle. She had a Winchester carbine that had belonged to her late husband, and on the evenings when the work allowed, she would set up tin cans along the fence rail and practice. She was not yet particularly accurate, but she was consistent and she was improving, and she did not seem embarrassed by her learning curve, which Frank found oddly admirable. The first time he stayed past sunset was by accident. He had ridden out in the late afternoon and helped her pull an old fence post that had rotted at the base, and then there had been a question about the well lining that had turned into a longer conversation about the soil composition in the south field, and by the time they had finished talking the sky had gone from amber to rose to the deep violet blue of early evening, and the first stars were coming out over the Panhandle in that extravagant, unobstructed way they did when there was nothing between you and the sky for 50 miles in every direction. Matilda had made coffee on the small iron stove inside the house, which she had gotten functional within the first week, and they sat on the porch with their cups and watched the stars come out. Frank was not ordinarily a man who was comfortable with silence in the presence of another person, but with Matilda the silence felt different, less like an absence of conversation and more like a kind of ease, the way silence feels between people who have run out of things that need to be said and discovered there is still something pleasant in simply being in the same place. "You keep coming out here," she said, not accusingly, just as an observation. "It's on my patrol route," he said, and even as he said it he knew she did not believe it, and he knew she knew he knew. She looked at him sideways, and there was a faint warmth in her expression that she kept contained behind a kind of quiet dignity. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not looking for anyone to take care of me. I want that to be very clear." "That is extremely clear," Frank said, "and I'm not of a mind to complicate my life unnecessarily." "Neither am I." "Good," she said. "Good," he said. They both looked at the stars for a while longer, and when Frank finally rode home in the dark, his heart was doing something irritating and unfamiliar in his chest, like a horse that has picked up a stone in its hoof and cannot quite settle into its usual gait. He mentioned none of this to anyone. He especially did not mention it to Amos Wheeler, who had a gift for turning whatever he observed into conversational currency that circulated through Dusty Creek faster than weather news. He did not mention it to Sheriff Cal Drummond either, though Cal was a perceptive man who had been quietly watching his deputies' altered patrol routes with the amused patience of someone who has been married for 20 years and knows the signs. What Frank did instead was continue to ride out to the Hennessy place, Matilda's place. He corrected himself. It was Matilda's place now, with a variety of practical pretexts. He helped her repair a section of the barn wall. He identified the source of a ground squirrel problem in her kitchen garden and showed her how to run a wire barrier along the bed edges. He rode with her to Callaway Springs one Saturday in June when she needed to purchase a larger stock of seed and lumber, because the road between Dusty Creek and Callaway Springs was where the road thieves had been most active, and this was entirely a legitimate professional reason to accompany her, and had nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that the 12-mile ride each way would give him several hours of her company. Callaway Springs was larger than Dusty Creek, nearly 600 people, with a proper mercantile, a bank, and a hotel that had recently been built with pretensions toward the kind of establishments found in the bigger cities further east. Matilda moved through the town with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, making her purchases with a list she had written out in neat, small handwriting, comparing prices against what she had noted on a small fold of paper she kept in her coat pocket. Frank watched her navigate the mercantile with something very close to open admiration, which he was doing a poor job of keeping to himself. It was in Callaway Springs, outside the mercantile while they were loading her purchases into the wagon bed, that they encountered Wade Tanner. Wade Tanner was a cattle rancher from the eastern edge of Callaway Springs County, who had built his operation over the past decade through a combination of legitimate hard work, strategic water claim manipulation, and a willingness to apply pressure, social, legal, and occasionally otherwise, to smaller landowners who sat on water routes or grazing land he wanted access to. He was 43 years old, broad-faced, and dressed better than most men in the county, with the particular confident ease of someone who has been powerful long enough that he has forgotten what it felt like not to be. He knew about the Hennessy place. He had in fact been watching it for some time as a potential acquisition, and the news that someone had purchased it had reached him in a way that had not improved his mood. He walked up to the wagon while Frank was securing the load and looked at Matilda with a smile that had more calculation in it than warmth. "You must be the woman who bought the old Hennessy land," he said. "Wade Tanner. I run cattle east of here." Matilda gave him the same level, assessing look she gave everyone. Matilda Ford. "I heard you were taking on the place alone," he said. "That's a hard road, particularly for—" He paused in a way that was designed to seem considerate, "for someone in your situation." "My situation," Matilda repeated. "Running a homestead without, well," he spread his hands in a gesture of helpless observation. "Without a man, you mean." Her voice was perfectly pleasant. "I was going to say without established resources, but if you want to put it that way." He smiled again. "I've been thinking about making an offer on that land. It's prime ground for water access and I'd pay a fair price." "It's not for sale," Matilda said. "I'm sure we could come to an arrangement that would benefit you considerably more than struggling through on your own." Frank, who had stopped working on the wagon load and was now giving Wade Tanner his full attention, said quietly, "She said it's not for sale, Tanner." Tanner looked at him with the tolerant patience of someone who has been obstructed by minor obstacles before and expects them to move. "Just having a conversation, deputy." "So was I," Frank said. There was a pause, and then Tanner nodded pleasantly at Matilda. "You change your mind, Miss Ford, the offer stands." When he had gone, Matilda stood very still for a moment, and then turned back to checking the security of the wagon load, with a focus that was just slightly more intense than the task required. "He's going to be a problem," she said quietly. "Probably," Frank agreed, "but not a problem that can't be handled." She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite reliance but somewhere in the middle, complicated and warm, and she tucked it away quickly and went back to the wagon. Frank went back to tying down the load and tried to focus on the rope in his hands rather than on the tight, protective feeling that had risen in his chest the moment Tanner had stepped up to her. The drive home was quieter than the drive out had been, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that had weight to it and color. June deepened into the kind of dry heat that the Panhandle specialized in, where the sky was so blue it looked painted, and the grass went from green to gold in stages, so gradual you only noticed it had changed when you compared where it was at the beginning of the month to where it was at the end. Matilda's kitchen garden was doing better than anyone had expected, largely because she had diverted a small channel from the creek to run along its eastern edge. A piece of practical irrigation, engineering that Frank had never seen a homesteader in this part of Texas attempt on their own. She had also acquired 3 more chickens to accompany the original indignant passenger from the stage, and a small goat she had traded for with Rosa Camacho, a Mexican woman who lived with her family 2 miles down the road and who had become, over the weeks, something close to a friend and neighbor. The friendship with Rosa Camacho was itself a small act of significance, because in Dusty Creek in 1882, the social lines between Anglo settlers and the Mexican families who had been in the region far longer were drawn with a firmness that most people treated as simply part of the landscape, as natural and inevitable as the dry creeks in summer. Matilda treated it as neither natural nor inevitable. She had met Rosa at the trading post, had struck up a conversation about seed varieties over the seed barrel, and had thereafter visited regularly and been visited in return. Some of the town women pursed their lips about it. Matilda Ford gave the pursed lips exactly as much weight as they deserved, which was none at all. Frank noticed this too. He noticed it and added it to the growing, somewhat overwhelming catalog of things about Matilda Ford that he found himself thinking about in the small hours of the night when the wind came through the gaps in his cabin walls. He had a conversation with Cal Drummond about the road thieves in late June that somehow turned into a different kind of conversation. "You've been riding the North Road a lot," Cal said, not looking up from the reports he was working through. "Coverage," Frank said. "Is that right?" Cal made a mark on the paper. "How's the Ford woman getting on out there?" "Fine." "Well," Frank corrected himself. "Better than fine. She's doing remarkable work on the place." Cal looked up. He was 54 years old, with a broad gray mustache and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of human nature that very little in it surprised him anymore. He looked at Frank for a moment in silence. "Son," he said carefully, "if you're interested in a woman, the general approach that tends to work is to tell her." "I am not," Frank started. "I'm just making a general observation," Cal said mildly, and looked back down at his papers. Frank left the office and stood on the boardwalk in the heat and had a long, honest conversation with himself, which was the most difficult conversation he had in a long time. Because the truth of it, when he let himself stand still and look at it squarely, was this: he was falling in love with Matilda Ford. He had been falling in love with her since approximately the moment she had introduced herself to him with a chicken under her arm, and told him without apology that she was not there to be talked out of anything. And the other truth, the one that sat underneath that one like a root system under dry ground, was that it terrified him. Not in the way that danger terrified him. He was not particularly afraid of danger. He had learned over his years as a lawman how to manage his relationship with physical risk. But in the deeper, more fundamental way that mattered. Because Matilda Ford was someone worth losing, and the things worth losing were the things that could hurt you worst. He had organized his life very carefully around not having anything worth losing. He went home to his cabin and sat in the dark for a while, and then got up and made himself a cup of coffee, and went to sit on the doorstep and watch the stars and thought about what it would mean to let himself want something this much. He did not come to any conclusions that night, but he did not stop riding the North Road. The road thieves became an actual problem in mid-July, which at least gave Frank something to focus on that was not complicated by his heart. A family named Sorensen lost a full wagon of goods on the Callaway Springs Road, and 2 weeks later, a young cowboy named Pete Aldridge was robbed at gunpoint of his entire month's wages on the same stretch. Frank rode the road repeatedly, talked to everyone he could talk to, and eventually pieced together from fragments of information, a description here, a detail of method there, that the thieves were a group of 3 men who came out of a camp somewhere in the broken country south of the road, and who had been working this route with increasing boldness, because no one had caught them yet. He mentioned the situation to Matilda one afternoon in late July when he was helping her reinforce the gate hinges on the barn, because the road passed within 2 miles of her property on its north-south stretch, and he wanted her to be aware of it. She listened, asked clear questions, and then went and loaded the Winchester carbine with a calm efficiency that suggested she had been expecting at some point to have a reason to do exactly this. "You have gotten considerably better with that," Frank said, watching her. "I practice every evening," she said. "I told you I would." "You did." She set the rifle in the rack above the door with the ease of familiarity. Then she turned and looked at him, and there was a charged quality to the air between them in the close warmth of the barn that was different from any of the previous moments, which had been many and had all had their own qualities. This one was something new. "Frank," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of a conversational prompt, just his name, dropped into the air between them like something deliberate. "Matilda," he said, and it came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him steadily. "You have been kind to me since I arrived here, consistently and genuinely kind, and I have appreciated it. I want you to know that." "It hasn't been, it's not," he stopped, started again. "I don't come out here because I think you need looking after." "I know that," she said. "That's part of why it matters." The silence stretched between them and was full of something that neither of them quite knew how to walk through. Frank was aware of every small thing, the dust motes in the slanted afternoon light, the shift of his horse outside, the particular shade of her eyes in the dimness of the barn. He took a step toward her and she did not move back, and he stopped when there was perhaps 2 feet between them and said in a low, careful voice, "I need you to know that I am not particularly good at this." "At what?" He gestured vaguely and felt immediately foolish, but she seemed to understand because her expression shifted into something warm and complicated. "I'm not sure anyone is," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same hand she had thrust at him the first day she arrived, with the same firm, capable bones in it, and held it for a moment, and she let him, and that was the beginning of everything. It did not begin with a kiss, not that day. That day it began with their hands, and with her looking up at him in the afternoon light with the kind of expression that is exactly what it looks like and does not need translation, and with both of them standing still in a barn in the Texas Panhandle in July of 1882, recognizing something in each other that could not be unnamed once it was named. He did kiss her, eventually. It happened a week later, at the end of a long evening on her porch when the conversation had wandered through 20 different places and landed somewhere quiet and warm, and he had reached across the space between them and cupped her face in his hand with a gentleness that surprised even him, and she had looked at him for a long, complete moment before leaning in, and the kiss was slow and certain, and nothing like the careful, controlled man he had been building himself into for the past decade, and everything like the thing he had been holding back from himself since approximately that first Wednesday in May. When they broke apart, she pressed her forehead against his shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, which was the most vulnerability she allowed herself, and then sat straight again, and they both looked at the dark shapes of the cottonwood trees against the night sky and did not say anything for a while because they did not need to. The summer moved forward in the way that it does when you have someone to share it with, more present, more detailed, more lit from within. Frank came out to the homestead 4, sometimes 5 times a week now, and the pretense of patrol had been abandoned by mutual unspoken agreement. He helped with the work because the work needed doing, and because he had good hands and a strong back and he was there. She fed him supper more evenings than not, and it was remarkable cooking considering the limitations of what she had to work with. She could do things with dried beans and salt pork, and whatever the garden was producing that Frank's own cooking bore no resemblance to. Rosa Camacho came by once when Frank was there, with her eldest daughter Elena, who was 12, and took in the situation with the quick, warm intelligence of a woman who has been reading people all her life. She smiled at Frank with the particular satisfaction of someone watching something they have been hoping for come into being, and said something to Matilda in Spanish that made Matilda go slightly pink and respond with a short, firm sentence that made Rosa laugh. "What did she say?" Frank asked afterward. "Nothing that needs repeating," Matilda said. He loved her by then. He knew he loved her. He just had not yet entirely resolved what to do with knowing it, because the problem with loving someone was that it made you want things specific, hopeful, forward-looking things, and wanting things meant being willing to be hurt by their absence, and he was still working through, stone by stone, the wall he had built around himself over a decade. Wade Tanner came to her property in August. Frank was not there when it happened. He heard about it from Rosa Camacho, who had been visiting when Tanner rode up with 2 of his hands and made, in Rosa's precise and unamused words, a nuisance of himself. He had reiterated his offer on the land. He had pointed out that the growing season had been harder than expected due to the dry July, which was true, and he had implied, without quite stating outright, that a woman alone with no resources behind her and a difficult year ahead might find herself in a position she had not anticipated, and that his offer represented a sensible alternative to hardship. Matilda had told him, according to Rosa, in a voice of perfect composure and absolute steel, that she had managed her accounts carefully, that her harvest prospects were reasonable, that she had credit at the trading post and a good relationship with her neighbors, and that his presence on her property without invitation was not something she intended to extend further. She had then pointed toward the road with the Winchester carbine, which she was holding in both hands in a way that was not quite threatening, but was not threatening either. Tanner had left. When Frank heard this story, he felt several things in rapid succession. First, a fierce and slightly embarrassing pride, and second, a cold recognition that Tanner was not the kind of man who accepted being turned down gracefully, and third, a very clear and urgent sense that Matilda should not be out there alone. He rode out the next morning and was direct with her. He told her what he knew of Tanner, not just the ambition and the acquisitiveness, but the specific pattern he had with small landowners, the way he used legal and financial pressure when physical pressure was too risky. The water rights disputes he had won through methods that were technically within the law but only just. He told her all of it sitting at her kitchen table with the morning coming through the windows and her coffee warming his hands. She listened to all of it. She asked careful questions. She sat for a moment when he was finished and then said, "I know all of this, Frank, or most of it. Rosa has told me things. I am not unaware of what he is. I know you're not. But I'm also not leaving. So what we need to talk about is not whether I should go but what to do about him." Frank looked at her across the table. The light was coming in golden and long through the east-facing window, and it was catching in her hair and in the composed, serious expression of her face. And he loved her so completely in that moment that it felt like something physical, like a pressure against his chest. He started, and then stopped because what he had been about to say was complicated and he was not sure he had the right to say it yet. "I could what?" she asked. "Matilda." He put his cup down. He looked at her. "You know what I'm working up to saying. I think you've known for a while. And I'm not saying it because of Tanner. I want to be absolutely clear about that. This has nothing to do with him." She was very still. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "I know I have been very careful with myself for a long time and that I am not, by temperament, a man who leads with what he's feeling. I know that." He paused. "But I want you to know that I have been, I love you. I want to be plain about it. I love you." She was quiet for a long moment, and Frank held himself very still against the fear that always lived underneath the wanting. Then she said, "I love you too, you frustrating, careful man." And there was water in her eyes that she was absolutely not going to let fall, and a smile underneath the steadiness of her expression that was the most complete thing he had ever seen. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood to meet him, and they held onto each other in the morning light in her kitchen with their arms tight around each other. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because it did not require saying. It was 2 days after this, when they had spent the intervening time in a state of warmth and clarity, and a new kind of ease that Frank had never felt before in his life, that Cal Drummond rode out to the homestead on official business. He had received a formal complaint from Wade Tanner, alleging that Frank Brooks had conducted himself in a manner inconsistent with his duties as a deputy sheriff, by providing personal favor and protection to a specific property owner in a manner that compromised his neutrality. The complaint was thin. It would have been laughed out of any real legal proceeding. But Tanner had money and connections and the ability to make noise, and Cal had to take it formally and respond formally, which meant Frank needed to recuse himself from any professional involvement with the Ford property while the complaint was under review. It was, to use the most charitable language available, a calculated piece of maneuvering. "He knows what he's doing," Frank said tightly. "He knows exactly what he's doing," Cal agreed. "But I have to follow the process. 2 weeks while the circuit judge reviews it." He looked at Frank and then at Matilda, who had heard all of this with the still, precise attention she brought to things that required strategy. "I'm sorry, Matilda." "Don't be sorry," she said. "It's not your fault." She was looking out the window toward the road. "He thinks that if Frank can't come out here officially, I'm more vulnerable. He thinks that changes things." "Does it?" Cal asked carefully. She turned back from the window. "No, it does not." The 2 weeks of the formal complaint review were, in practical terms, the hardest stretch of that summer. Frank could not ride the North Road on official business, and he and Matilda had agreed, without making it into a large conversation, that they did not want to give Tanner any legitimate fuel for his complaint by making their personal relationship publicly visible during the review period. Frank hated it. He hated sitting in the sheriff's office doing paperwork, while the North Road was unpatrolled, and while Matilda was out there alone in the way that Tanner had calculated for. But Matilda was not, as it turned out, alone in any meaningful sense. Rosa Camacho's husband Manuel, who was a large, quiet, deeply capable man who farmed the 2-mile stretch to the south, and who had taken a dim view of Tanner since a fence dispute 3 years prior, began riding past the Ford property every morning. One of the other homesteaders on the road, a taciturn Swedish farmer named Anders Gustafsson, took to checking in every other day on the entirely practical pretext of discussing whether the creek water level was affecting his south field, which required him to ride by Matilda's gate. And Amos Wheeler, who knew everything and everyone, happened to mention to several people over the course of several conversations that any trouble that came to the Ford property on the North Road would be trouble that found the whole road paying attention. It was a small, quiet, unorganized thing, the way communities protect their own when they choose to, and it worked. Tanner did not come back to the property during those 2 weeks. He was waiting, Frank suspected, for the legal pressure to do what physical presence had not done. It didn't. The circuit judge reviewed the complaint in 3 days rather than 2 weeks. Apparently, he had enough familiarity with Tanner's history of using legal mechanisms for leverage that the review did not require extensive deliberation, and dismissed it as without merit. Frank was on his horse and on the North Road within 30 minutes of receiving the word. He found Matilda in the kitchen garden, on her knees in the dirt pulling weeds in a way that looked somewhat therapeutic, and she looked up when she heard his horse and her whole face shifted in a way she did not bother to conceal. 2 weeks and 4 days, she said. 12 days, he corrected, and was off the horse before it had fully stopped. He pulled her up out of the garden and held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment, dirt on her cheek, hair falling out of its pins, eyes bright and fierce and warm, and kissed her in a way that had 12 days of missing in it. And she put her hands on his arms and kissed him back. And from the barn the goat made a sound of mild commentary. They were laughing by the time they broke apart, and the laughing felt as important as the kissing. It was Frank who brought up the future first. It was an evening in early September, when the heat had finally begun to ease into something more bearable, and the sky had taken on the particular blue-gray quality of early autumn in the Panhandle. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become their best time of day, and Frank had been carrying a thought around for several weeks that had finally become too heavy to keep carrying. "I've been thinking," he said, which was how he began most of his important sentences, "about what comes next." Matilda set her coffee cup on the porch rail. "Next in what sense?" He looked at her sideways. "In the sense of you and me, in the permanent sense." He paused. "I want to marry you, Matilda. I want you to know that's what I mean. That's what I want." She was quiet for a moment that felt long. Then she said, "And what is it that's making you say that carefully instead of just saying it?" He was quiet too. Then, "I have spent the better part of 10 years being afraid of wanting something I could lose. I am aware that I am probably not the most natural candidate for the kind of person who wants permanently." He looked at his hands. "But I want it. I want it more than I've wanted anything. And I want to be honest with you about both things, that I want it, and that I know what it costs me to say it." The silence after that had a particular quality, like the moment before rain. "Frank Brooks," she said, and her voice was rough with something she was mostly holding back, "asking me to marry you is not something you need to make a deposition about. I know. You could just ask." He looked at her. There was a long, specific moment between them in which everything they had been to each other over the past months was present: the chicken in the carpet bag, the first meal on the porch, the hand she had let him hold in the barn, the morning light on her face when he told her he loved her, 12 days of missing her like a pulled tooth, all of it present in the space between them. "Matilda Ford," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him with an expression that was composed and clear and completely certain. "Yes," she said, "I will." It was not done with ceremony. It was done sitting on a porch in early September with coffee cups and the first hint of autumn in the air, and it was the most important thing Frank Brooks had ever said in his life. They set the date for the last Saturday of October, which gave them 6 weeks to make the arrangements, and gave the October weather enough time to commit to its intention before they committed to being outdoors in it. The church had been rebuilt for the second time the previous year and was in reasonable shape. The preacher, Reverend Ellison, was a thin, earnest man in his 40s who performed his duties with genuine warmth and who was, as far as Frank could tell, genuinely pleased at the news. The preparations were, in most ways, a study in Matilda Ford as the world had come to know her. Practical, competent, unsentimental about the parts that did not matter, and entirely committed to the parts that did. She made her own dress, not the elaborate, tiered white confection that fashion magazines of the era might have specified, but a dress in deep ivory cotton with a simple, perfect fit, embroidered at the cuffs and collar with small, careful flowers that she did herself on the evenings when the field work was done. Rosa Camacho helped with the embroidery and with the alterations, and the two women spent several evenings in the lamplight of Matilda's kitchen doing the delicate work and talking in the mixed Spanish and English that their friendship had developed into. Frank, for his part, was handling the preparations with somewhat less grace. It was not that he had changed his mind. That was a critical thing to understand. He had not changed his mind. He did not waver in his love for Matilda or in his certainty that marrying her was the right and true thing. What he was experiencing in the weeks before the wedding was something different and considerably more interior. A kind of reckoning with himself. A long and honest audit of the man he had been versus the man he intended to be, and the places where the gap between those two things was wider than he would have liked. He had been solitary for so long that the prospect of permanent, daily, non-negotiable closeness produced in him a quality of discomfort that he recognized as not rational, but that was real nonetheless. He lay awake at night going over conversations he had had with Matilda in which he had been too guarded, too careful, too far behind the wall, and thinking about the kind of husband he wanted to be and whether he was capable of it. He talked about it eventually, which was its own kind of progress. He talked about it to Cal Drummond, who listened with the patience of a man who has been married for 20 years and recognizes what is happening. "I love her," Frank said. "That part is not in question." "I know," Cal said. "It's everything else that I'm—" He stopped. "You're afraid," Cal said, not unkindly. "I'm afraid." Cal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what the thing about Mamie and me is, the thing that made it work." He was referring to his wife, Martha, who everyone called Mamie. "I decided to let myself be known by her, all the way, the parts that were good and the parts that weren't." He paused. "It's the scariest thing I have ever done. It is also the best thing. Both of those things are true at the same time." Frank looked at him for a long moment and then looked away. "You know all of this already," Cal said. "You just need to hear it said out loud." There was also, in those weeks before the wedding, the unresolved matter of Wade Tanner. Tanner had not made another overt move on the Ford property since the failure of his legal complaint, but there were indicators, small, indirect, the kind of thing you only noticed if you were paying close attention, that his interest had not entirely abated. He had been making inquiries about the creek water rights in the North Road corridor. He had had a conversation with a land agent in Callaway Springs about the surveying boundaries of several adjacent properties. Frank had heard about both of these things through the reliable network of Amos Wheeler's postal intelligence, and he had been keeping a quiet eye on them. The week before the wedding, Frank went to see Tanner directly. He found him at his operation east of Callaway Springs, a substantial ranch with a well-built main house and several outbuildings, and he rode up on a Tuesday morning and asked to speak with him privately. Tanner came out onto the porch with his arms crossed and the particular expression of a man who is prepared to be tolerant of a minor inconvenience. "Deputy Brooks," he said. "Tanner." Frank dismounted and stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'll make this brief. Matilda Ford is marrying me on Saturday. The Ford property becomes a Brooks property in the eyes of the county. Any ongoing attention you have been directing toward the water rights in that corridor is going to be something that comes to me professionally. I want to make sure you understand that there is now no version of pursuing the Ford, the Brooks land, that does not come directly across my desk." Tanner looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was unreadable. "You're telling me this as law enforcement," he said. "I'm telling you this as both," Frank said. Another long moment. Then Tanner said, "Congratulations on your upcoming marriage," in a tone that was perfectly civil and entirely final, and went back inside his house. Frank rode back toward Dusty Creek with the feeling of a door closing cleanly behind him. He went straight to the homestead afterward and told Matilda what he had done. She listened with her arms folded and an expression that was working through several things at once. "You didn't need to do that," she said finally. "I know. I was handling Tanner." "I know that too," she looked at him, "but you did it anyway." "I did, and I want to be clear that it was not because I think you can't handle him. It was because he's been a shadow over something that matters a great deal to me, and I wanted to look him in the eye and make it plain." He paused. "I may have overstepped." She was quiet for a moment, and then her expression softened from its work through complexity into something simpler and warmer. "You may have," she said, "but I find I'm not particularly upset about it." He let out a breath. She came and stood close to him and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder in the way that she did, economically and without fanfare. And he put his arm around her, and they stood in the autumn afternoon light on her porch and looked at the cottonwood trees, which had gone golden at the edges. "4 more days," she said. "4 more days," he agreed. The Saturday of the wedding arrived with the kind of weather that October in the Texas Panhandle can provide when it is inclined to be generous, dry, and clear. The sky a deep, pure blue, the air cool enough to require a coat in the morning but warming by midday to a perfect, golden mildness. The cottonwood trees on the North Road had gone fully golden, and some of the leaves had begun to come down, turning slowly in the still air. Dusty Creek had been preparing for the wedding in the way small towns prepare for the weddings of people they are generally fond of, which is to say with considerable enthusiasm and some competitive investment in who could contribute what to the occasion. Mamie Drummond had organized the reception provisions. Henry Pratt at the trading post had donated a case of good wine. The Mexican families along the North Road, led by Rosa Camacho, had made food that had been arriving at the church for 2 days in covered dishes that smelled like heaven. Amos Wheeler had, somewhat unexpectedly, produced a fiddle and the information that he had been playing since boyhood and would be honored to provide music. The church was full. This, more than anything, told you something about who Matilda Ford had become in Dusty Creek in the 6 months since she arrived. She had not sought out popularity or community position. She had simply been exactly who she was, practically and honestly and without performing anything, and the town had come to know her and to value her in the direct, unglamorous way that genuine respect develops. Frank stood at the front of the church with Reverend Ellison, and with Cal Drummond beside him as his witness, and he looked at the filled pews and the decorated ends with their autumn boughs, and he was honest with himself about what he was feeling. He was the most reluctant man at the altar. He knew it. He could feel it in the particular quality of stillness he was holding himself in the careful, controlled steadiness of his breathing, in the way his hands needed to be consciously unclenched. Not because he did not want to marry Matilda. He wanted to marry her more than he had ever wanted anything in the careful, limited life he had constructed. But the wanting was exactly what was producing the reluctance, because the wanting was the proof of how much he had to lose, and the ceremony was the moment when all of that wanting would become permanent and irrevocable and real in a way that could not be walked back or hedged against. Cal leaned slightly toward him. "Breathe," he said quietly. Frank breathed. The doors at the back of the church opened and Matilda came in. She walked without anyone to give her away, because there was no one to fill that role, and she did not require the role to be filled. She walked in her ivory dress with its careful embroidered flowers, with her hair pinned up but with the familiar curls escaping around her face in the way they always did, and she carried a small bunch of autumn wildflowers that Rosa Camacho's daughter Elena had gathered from the creek bank that morning. She walked down the aisle with the same particular quality she had stepped out of the stage with on the first morning. Not like she was arriving at the end of something, but like she was arriving at the beginning. She looked at him as she came down the aisle, and her expression was steady and warm and completely without pretense. And in it, Frank could see everything she was. The woman who had come off a stage alone with a chicken in a crate and bought a broken homestead and repaired it inch by inch. Who had stood with a Winchester carbine and told a powerful man the answer was no. Who had let him hold her hand in a barn in July and taught him, without meaning to, how to be unafraid of wanting. She came to stand beside him, and he looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted. He felt it happen the way you feel a change in the weather, not all at once but in a clear, unmistakable alteration of everything. The reluctance he had been holding, that careful, protective self-preservation that had kept him standing inside walls for a decade, moved through him and out of him as cleanly as breath, and what was left in its place was something he did not have a word for except perhaps this. Certain. He was the most certain man he had ever been in his life. Reverend Ellison began to speak, and Frank and Matilda stood facing each other in the filled church, and the words of the ceremony moved through the air around them. And when it came time for Frank to say his vows, his voice was steady and direct, and carried to every corner of the church without any performance in it because it needed none. It was simply true, all of it, every word. He watched her say hers and he thought, with the particular precision of a man who is fully present in a moment for perhaps the first time in his adult life, that this was the bravest thing he had ever done, and that it did not feel like bravery at all. It felt like coming home. Reverend Ellison said the last word. He pronounced them husband and wife. And Frank Brooks, who had been the most reluctant man at the altar, put his hands on his wife's face and kissed her with a certainty that had no reservation in it and never would again, while the church full of Dusty Creek erupted in the kind of noise that small towns make when something has gone exactly right. Rosa Camacho was crying. Mamie Drummond was crying. Amos Wheeler struck up the fiddle before anyone asked him to. Cal Drummond, who was not crying at all and would have denied it categorically if asked, had an expression that was as close to tender as his face knew how to get. The reception moved out of the church and into the open air in front of it, because it was that kind of October day, and the food that had been arriving in covered dishes for 2 days was set out on long tables, and it was every bit as wonderful as it had smelled. There was wine and there was music, and there were children running in the dry leaves, and the sun moved across the clear sky in its long, golden arc. Frank and Matilda moved through it all together, and there was something different about the together now. It had mass and permanence. It was anchored in something that had been witnessed and spoken and made real, and Frank kept looking at her and finding in her the same thing every time, which was Matilda, his wife, the most direct and clear and fully realized person he had ever known. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, when the music had moved from ceremony to celebration and people were dancing in the dirt in front of the church, he took her hand and walked her away from the main group, around the side of the church where it was quieter, and they leaned against the wall in the sunlight and she looked up at him with a smile that was wide and a little shy, which was not something he associated with her generally and which undid him entirely. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "We did it, we did." She leaned her head against his shoulder, not the brief economical gesture she usually allowed herself but fully, restingly, and he put his arm around her and held her there in the afternoon sun. "I was afraid you were going to bolt," she said quietly. He looked down at her. "You could tell. I could always tell," she said. "You are a very transparent man for someone who thinks he keeps things hidden." He laughed, which was not something he did easily but which had been happening more and more since May. "I wasn't going to bolt. I knew you wouldn't, but I could see you working through it." He held her closer. "I'm done working through it." "I know that too," she said. "I could see that as well." They stayed like that for a while in the warmth of the October afternoon, And then the sound of Amos Wheeler's fiddle pulled them back around to the front of the church, where people wanted to dance with them. And they went back and they danced in the dirt with the golden leaves coming down from the cottonwood trees, and the sun going amber over the flat Panhandle horizon. The years that followed were built on the same foundation as the months that had come before them: work and honesty, and the particular steady warmth of two people who know each other without pretense. Frank moved to the homestead, keeping his position as deputy sheriff and riding the 6 miles into Dusty Creek and back each day on a route that was now genuinely part of his patrol. The house that had been Matilda's became their house, and over the first winter they expanded it, Frank and Manuel Camacho together, over a series of cold Saturdays, adding a third room to the east side that made the whole structure something you could properly call a home. Their first child was a boy, born in the summer of 1883. They named him James after Matilda's father, and he arrived in the world with Frank's dark hair and his mother's measuring eyes. And he was, by the general consensus of everyone who encountered him, a remarkable infant. Frank held him the first time with the same careful stillness he had learned to hold himself in during those weeks before the wedding, but there was nothing of reluctance in it this time. There was only the overwhelming, slightly terrifying weight of love, which he was by then considerably more practiced at not being afraid of. The homestead grew in the way that homesteads do when they are tended by capable and determined people. The kitchen garden expanded into a proper producing garden with enough surplus in good years to sell at the trading post and to put up in the root cellar for the winters. The chicken flock grew to a size that required its own small structure. The south field that Matilda had surveyed from the first went into corn in 1883 and produced a better yield than most of the established farms in the area, which caused Henry Pratt at the trading post to look at Matilda with a new expression that was somewhere between admiration and chagrin. In 1884, they acquired their first 4 head of cattle, a small start, but a start, the beginning of the herd Matilda had imagined from the beginning. Frank built the fence for the grazing pasture and Matilda managed the cattle with the same methodical competence she brought to everything, learning from Manuel Camacho, who had been farming and ranching the North Road for 15 years, and from a Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association handbook she had acquired from a traveling bookseller and read 3 times cover to cover. Wade Tanner never came back to the North Road. Whether it was Frank's visit to him in the week before the wedding or the subsequent visibility of the Brooks name on the property or simply his own calculation that the opportunity had closed, he redirected his attention elsewhere and left them in peace. Frank received word through Cal Drummond's channels in 1885 that Tanner had sold his Eastern Callaway Springs operation and moved further south toward San Antonio, where there were larger opportunities and, presumably, smaller obstacles. Cal Drummond retired from the sheriff's position in 1885, and Frank was appointed to take it over, which was the least surprising professional development in the county's recent history. He was a good sheriff, still fair, still steady, still able to handle trouble without making more of it, and now also less armored than he had been, which made him better at the human parts of the job that required something beyond steadiness. He had learned in the years since Matilda that being known fully by someone who loved you did not diminish you. It expanded you. Mamie Drummond, who had become something between a mother figure and a close friend to Matilda, watched this development with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been married to a good man and recognizes the making of another one. Rosa and Manuel Camacho remained their closest neighbors and closest friends through all of these years, and the friendship between the families was easy and deep and genuine. Rosa and Matilda gardened together and cooked together and argued amiably about the correct proportion of chili in everything, and their children played together in the long summer evenings in the grass between the 2 properties. The fact that this friendship crossed lines that many in the county still treated as fixed and significant did not appear to trouble either of them, and their husbands, for their part, had worked side by side through too many practical crises to remember that there was anything unusual about it. The schoolhouse in Dusty Creek was without a teacher for a full year in 1885 after the previous one left for Denver, and Matilda, who had been her father's daughter in ways she was still discovering, stepped in and taught the children for the spring term while the school board searched for a replacement. She taught them with the same direct, unadorned competence she brought to everything, and the children, including her own son James, who was 2 and present by necessity, benefited from it in ways that the school board was still talking about the following year when the permanent replacement arrived. Several parents specifically asked if Mrs. Brooks might consider continuing, and Matilda considered it and continued to help through the years on the occasions when the school needed her. Their second child came in 1886, a daughter this time, whom they named Clara Rose Clara for no particular person, and Rose because it was a name that both of them had said at once when they were going through the list, which they agreed was a sign. Clara arrived with her mother's dark eyes and Frank's jaw, and she was from her earliest weeks a person of strong and fully formed opinions, which surprised no one who knew her parents. In the autumn of 1887, 5 years after Frank had walked into the Dusty Creek trading post on a Wednesday morning and been nearly walked into by a woman with a chicken under her arm, he and Matilda sat on the porch of their expanded, well-tended homestead in the October evening. James was 4, asleep inside. Clara was 1 and also asleep, through the particular exhausted determination of a child who had spent the day doing more than a 1-year-old was strictly qualified for. The goat, who had outlived every reasonable expectation and several veterinary predictions, was in the barn. The cottonwood trees had gone golden again. They did this every year, and every year it had the quality of a specific, private anniversary. The turning of the leaves was where they measured themselves, because it was in October that they had married, and it was in October that the light in the Panhandle had this particular quality that lit the gold of the trees against the deep blue of the sky in a way that was unlike any other time of year. Matilda had her coffee and Frank had his, and their boots were almost touching on the porch rail, and the evening was coming in slow and golden over the flat horizon. 5 years, Matilda said. 5 years, he agreed. She looked at him with the expression she had been giving him for 5 years, the one that was clear and warm and entirely without pretense, the one that saw all of him and had decided yes, specifically and deliberately in full knowledge. "Are you happy?" she asked. She asked it without hesitation, directly, the way she asked everything. Frank thought about the answer for a moment, not because he was uncertain of it but because he wanted to give it properly, the way it deserved. "I am the happiest I have ever been," he said. "And I am not saying that because it is the appropriate thing to say. I am saying it because it is the plainest true thing I know." She looked at him for a moment and then reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. He turned his palm up and held hers in the way he had been holding it since a July afternoon in a barn in 1882, with the same careful recognition of what it was worth. "I thought about what you said once," she said, "about being afraid of wanting something you could lose. I remember. I think about it because I understand it. Daniel died. I know what it is to lose something." She was quiet for a moment. "But I think the answer to being afraid of loss is not to want less. I think the answer is to want more and hold it as well as you can and know that whatever time you get with it is more than you had before you had it." Frank looked at her in the October evening light and felt, with the fullness and simplicity of someone who has come a long way from where they started, that she was the most right person he had ever known. "Matilda Brooks," he said. "Frank Brooks," she said back and smiled. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, which was not something he did often but which carried, when he did, the complete weight of everything he meant, and she let it. And the evening deepened around them, and the golden leaves from the cottonwood trees came down one by one in the still air, and the stars began to show themselves over the Texas Panhandle one by one as well, until the sky was full of them, brilliant and unobstructed for 50 miles in every direction. In the spring of 1888, Matilda discovered she was expecting their third child. She told Frank on a Tuesday evening while he was bringing his horse in from the east pasture, calling out to him from the porch with the straightforward calm she brought to important information. He walked up to the porch and stood at the bottom step and looked at her, and the feeling that went through him was identical in quality and depth to the feeling that had gone through him at the altar in October of 1882, when she came walking down the church aisle, toward him, the feeling of something settling into its right and final place. He stepped up onto the porch and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and she laughed against his lips with the surprise of a woman who had expected composure from him. "You're pleased," she said. "I am enormously pleased," he confirmed. "Even though James is still wild and Clara has decided she owns the goat and anything else she can get her hands on. Even so," he said, "I am entirely and without reservation pleased." The third child arrived in December, a boy again, whom they named William Cole, William for Frank's own grandfather, whose name had meant something to him, though the man himself had been gone before Frank was old enough to know him, and Cole simply because it sounded right and solid and honest, which were the qualities they had come to associate with good names. William Cole Brooks arrived on a cold December evening with a full head of red hair that surprised everyone and which would continue to surprise people for years, since neither of his parents had a strand of red between them, but which the child appeared to own completely and without apology. He was a quieter baby than either of his siblings had been, watchful and present and warm, and he slept with an ease that made Matilda wonder aloud whether he was compensating for the exhaustion his parents had accumulated during Clara's infancy. It was Frank who walked the older two children to the window of the bedroom to show them their new brother, James with his dark hair and measuring eyes and the solemn weight of being 4, and Clara barely 2 and frankly skeptical. He held James's hand and Clara's hand and crouched down between them to their level and said, "That is your brother William." James considered this for a moment. "He has funny hair," he said. "He does," Frank agreed. "Do I have to share the goat?" "The goat," Frank said, looking up at Matilda, who was watching this from the bed with an expression of profound amusement, "is going to need to make some adjustments." Matilda laughed, and it was the best sound in the room. The homestead on the North Road of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the late 1880s was, by any honest measure, a thriving and self-sufficient place. The cattle herd had grown to 22 head by 1889. The garden produced enough in the summer months to feed the family generously and trade the surplus for goods they could not produce themselves. The barn had been expanded and rebuilt to proper capacity. The house had another room added this time on the north side, with Frank and Manuel building through 2 weekends in the spring, which had become a comfortable and familiar kind of work. The Camacho and Brooks families continued to celebrate their holidays together and to help each other through the difficult seasons, and the easy mixture of Spanish and English that characterized their friendship had worked its way into the daily speech of all the children on both properties, which the older generation on both sides agreed was no bad thing. Elena Camacho, who had been 12 when Frank first met her family, was by 1889 20 years old and studying to be a teacher, making use of the schooling that Matilda had specifically encouraged her toward, and that her parents had supported with the particular pride of people who have worked hard to give their children options they themselves had not had. The injustice of that particular reality was not lost on Matilda or Frank. That Elena's intelligence and drive had been equally present since childhood, but that the pathways for her had been narrower than they would have been for a child of a different background. That the same community that valued the Brooks family warmly had drawn lines around the Camacho family that were unearned and undeserved. Matilda had said this plainly to anyone who would hear it, with the same unembellished directness she applied to everything, and Frank had backed her in it from his position as the town sheriff, which was a position that carried weight whether he traded on it or not. Amos Wheeler continued to deliver the mail and the news in equal measure, and his fiddle playing had grown, over the years, from a pleasant novelty to something approaching local legend. He played at every wedding and most of the dances and several of the funerals, and he was of the opinion that music was one of the 3 or 4 things that made civilization worth having, which was a view that the population of Dusty Creek generally shared. Cal Drummond and Mamie came to supper on the first Sunday of every month, which had become such an established rhythm that it required no planning or invitation. They simply appeared, and Matilda cooked, and the 4 of them sat around the table that Frank had built from good oak timber and talked about the things that mattered to them, which included the growth of the town and the state of the cattle market, and the children and the garden and whatever books were circulating. Because Mamie Drummond was a reader of considerable appetite, and had taken to lending her volumes to Matilda and discussing them, which Frank and Cal observed from the edges of with the comfortable bemusement of men who are pleased to be adjacent to something that gives other people genuine pleasure. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, October 1887, Frank had given Matilda a pair of silver earrings that he had purchased from a traveling jeweler who came through Dusty Creek in September. This was not something she had expected, and she had held them in her palm for a moment with an expression that was trying not to be moved and failing entirely. "They're not much," he said. "They're lovely," she said. "You don't wear jewelry much." "I'll wear these," she said, and put them in immediately, and wore them that evening at the small dinner Cal and Mamie came to, and looked, Frank thought privately, like someone lit from within. On the 10th anniversary, in October of 1892, he gave her something different, a deed of title for the additional 40 acres to the south that had come available when the property adjacent to theirs changed hands. He had been tracking the opportunity for 2 years and had saved carefully toward it, and the 40 acres included a stretch of the creek bank that would expand their water access considerably. When he spread the deed on the table in front of her, she read it twice and then looked up at him with an expression that was so fully open and unguarded that it was the most intimate thing he had ever seen on her face. "Frank," she said. "It's good land," he said, "and we've earned it." She stood up and walked around the table and put both arms around him, which she did not usually do first, and held on with the same strength she put into everything, and he held her back. "We have," she said against his shoulder. "We really have." It was true. They had earned it, not in the narrow sense of financial transaction, but in every sense. They had earned each other, slowly and honestly, through work and honesty and the willingness to be known, and they had earned the life they had built together on the North Road with its cottonwood trees, and its kitchen garden and its 22 head of cattle and its 3 children and its goat, who was by this time of an age that was geologically significant and showed no signs of changing her ways. Dusty Creek grew slowly through these years. New families arrived on the southern road. The railroad, which had been approaching the region in stages, reached a point 30 miles to the east by 1890, and brought with it the connectivity and commerce that changed the cattle operations in the whole county, making it possible to ship to markets that had been previously inaccessible, and ending some of the older patterns of overland driving. Frank, as sheriff, managed the transition between the old ways and the new with the steady fairness that characterized everything he did, and was re-elected to the position twice, without significant opposition. James Brooks started at the Dusty Creek Schoolhouse in 1886 and took to reading with the immediate devotion of a child who has found the thing he was made for. By the time he was 12, he had read everything in the schoolhouse library and was borrowing from Mamie Drummond's collection and arguing with his mother about the finer points of whatever either of them was currently in. Clara Brooks, by contrast, took to horses at an age when most children were still learning to reliably stay upright without assistance, and could ride with a competence that was somewhat alarming by the time she was 7. William, the red-haired December child, was quieter than both of his siblings and had his father's quality of careful attention, the ability to watch a situation completely before engaging with it, which made him a formidable opponent at cards by the time he was old enough to play. They were different children, these three, and they were recognizably and undeniably the children of Frank and Matilda Brooks, which was a fact that Frank found privately wonderful every time he noticed it. He had not believed, for most of his life, that he was built for this, for permanence and attachment, and the daily weight of being necessary to other people. He had learned otherwise, and the learning had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. On an October evening in 1892, 10 years on from the first October when the leaves had turned, and Matilda Ford had walked down the aisle toward him in her ivory dress with its careful embroidered flowers, Frank and Matilda sat on the porch of their house in the last of the day's light. The children were inside, James at the table with a book, Clara somewhere in the barn with the horses, William asleep early as he sometimes did, in the quiet way he had of managing himself. The goat was in the pasture. The cattle were in the far field. The cottonwood trees were golden against the deep blue of the autumn sky. Matilda had her coffee. Frank had his. Their boots were almost touching on the porch rail. He looked at her in the October light, at this woman who had come off a stage with a chicken under her arm and bought a broken homestead and rebuilt it and built something larger around it. A life, a family, a place in the world that was genuinely and completely hers, that was theirs. And he thought about the man he had been before that first Wednesday in May of 1882, the careful, walled, solitary man who had organized his life around the absence of risk, and he thought about the man he was now. And the distance between those two men was the best measure of anything he knew. "Do you remember what you said to me," he asked, "about wanting to build something that belonged to you?" She looked at him. "I remember. Did it turn out the way you imagined?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the golden cottonwood trees and the wide, unobstructed Texas sky. Then she turned to look at him with the expression he loved best on her face, the one that was clear and warm and entirely without pretense. "It turned out better," she said. Frank Brooks looked at his wife in the October light and knew, with the complete and settled certainty of a man who has finally come to know himself, that she was the truest thing he had ever held, and that he would hold her, and this life they had made together on the North Road, for every day he was given. He reached across and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held his. The cottonwood leaves came down one by one in the still October air, and the stars began to appear over the Texas Panhandle, one by one and then all at once, brilliant and unobstructed and permanent above the flat, wide, generous earth.